interest of mine. My specialization academically is the religious traditions of India. So I've done a good deal of writing and research on Hinduism, Jainism, which is a little lesser known tradition of India, also Buddhism, which originated in India, though it spread throughout much of the rest of Asia early in its history. And I have a lot of personal connections with India. My wife is from India, and she teaches Japanese at Elizabethtown College. That sometimes confuses people. We're pretty international. We split our time between Pennsylvania and Japan and India. I've been to India quite a bit. I've been there 8 times altogether. First time was for 2 years. And in fact, most recently I've been invited to go back and teach in India at an institution for up to 2 years if I want to. I don't think Vedanta College is going to let me go for that long, but probably a semester or maybe a year. But quite a bit of interaction with India. Most of my interest has been in culture and religion, and so that's what I tend to focus on most of my work. But India, of course, more generally, is also fascinating to me, and I follow political affairs and events in India quite closely. And so I'll just flesh out maybe a little bit of what was given in the video presentation, which I thought was quite good. This is my first time seeing it, actually, along with all of you, but I thought it did a very good job on the issues that it covered. I think I can add a little bit of clarification, a little bit of depth to some aspects of it, and then open it up for your questions and comments so that we can have a discussion. So as was narrated in the film, this party was very heavily dominant over Indian politics for most of the last few decades. And there was a very strong bent early on in after independence toward socialism and somewhat of a leaning toward a Soviet model of economics, not of governance. India followed the British parliamentary system, still does today. And as indicated, it's a thriving and massive democracy. But in terms of economics, there was a far more of a preference toward a highly regulated, highly bureaucratized economy. And the results of this were not very good for India in terms of growth. There was a good deal of corruption. There were so many rules, and I have observed this myself in some of the time I've spent in India. There are so many rules and so many regulations that one is almost being invited to bribe someone to get things done that one needs to get done, because there's so much paperwork, there's so much involved. You just at the end of the day want to throw up your hands and say, is there somebody I can just pay to take care of this so this can happen? And that's the whole idea. That there are a lot of civil servants who supplement their income a great deal with these sort of under-the-table deals. And but as a result of that, it's very, very hard to get licenses, to get permits, and really for capitalism as we think of it in America, so growth was very, very low in India relative to other parts of Asia. Now, of course, China very famously, as described in the video, really took off economically starting in the late 70s. But to a great extent, this has been despite not being democracy, and we tend to think in the West of capitalism and democracy as going together. But China is really, in a way, disproving that thesis, because there is a kind of command capitalism happening. Things are directed by the party, and this growth has occurred. Whereas, to some extent in India, it's the democracy itself that has really, in some ways, prevented some of the deregulation from happening as quickly as it might otherwise have, because a lot of those regulations do protect people. And there's a concern that India not go to the other extreme, where there's no protection for workers, and things just sort of take off in the extreme opposite direction. But for the most part, the perspective has been that under the Congress Party, things were corrupt, things were overly regulated, India's creativity was being held back. And that widespread view was articulated loud and clear in the election last May of Narendra Modi when he became the Prime Minister of India. It's easy to mischaracterize. There is a tendency, I find, fortunately I didn't see it reflected in this film, but very often, especially in Western presentations of India, there will be a tendency to equate Hindu nationalist movements with the sort of very violent terrorist activities that we see committed in the name of Islamist movements, for example, in other parts of the world. And Hindu nationalism is not like that. I think a much better analogy can be drawn with the Christian right in the United States, where you have people who see America as essentially a Christian country with Christian values, and as suffering to the extent that it goes astray from those values. just substitute the words, Hinduism in India, and you have essentially Hindu nationalism. There's a sense that Hindu values are what made India great. Hinduism has been the dominant tradition of India for thousands of years. And in fact, it's seen by many Hindu nationalists that the solutions to many of our modern problems are there in ancient Hindu texts and values and ideals. And if I may be frank, it's not entirely a ridiculous view. There are, in fact, some very interesting insights in Hindu traditions about things like physical health, science, the environment, and so on, which people in the Western world are beginning to take notice of. Of course, the explosion of yoga, meditation, and so on. These show that this is a civilization with a lot of insight and wisdom to offer. Now, there was great glee and celebration, of course, on the Hindu nationalist side when he was elected. I follow these things on the internet quite a bit. There were a lot of people who started saying, okay, now Modi needs to call for a Hindu Rashtra, that is a Hindu state, to declare India a Hindu state. That would be like declaring America a Christian nation and doing away with the First Amendment. And of course, Modi has no interest in doing that at all. There was a rise in a movement among some Hindus to convert people from whose ancestors were Hindu, who've since been practicing either Christianity or Islam, to what's called reconvert them to Hinduism. So this movement picked up steam. And again, Modi said, the government has nothing to do with that. What people do with their religion is their own business.
It seems to me if there's so much unemployment in India among the young people, how are they feeding their people? What's the role of agriculture in India?
Okay, good question. Good question. Well, agriculture is massive in India. There are states that are very agriculturally productive in India, but there's a lot of hunger too. There are people who are simply not being fed. There is starvation in places, and it's very uneven, I would say. Some of the rural areas are some of the ones most hard hit by poverty. At the same time, some of those same rural areas are places where it is possible to sort of go out into the forest and gather fruits and that sort of thing. I mean, there are people who just forage for their families, and that's how they survive. Then you get into the cities, and you have a very different situation. There's a beautiful shopping mall in New Delhi, and you go to it, and there's a special grocery store, and about half the people there are foreigners, but it's just got everything you can imagine, cheeses and stuff imported from Europe and the whole works. So the idea of the two Indias is I think a pretty accurate one, that you have a lot of affluence, in fact, in the growing middle class and of course the wealthier classes. But you have this much, much larger swath of the population who really do barely get by. Sure, there are people who average less than a meal a day among the poorest of the poor.
What are they doing? What's the government doing to aid?
Well, as much as it can, I would say. Of course, there are always the corruption issues. There are always things that are earmarked for aid and then end up diverted to someplace where they're not supposed to be. But there's quite a bit that has been done. And as the economy has improved and the Indian government has more wealth to tap into, they've been able to do more. In fact, India contributed aid to other countries during the big tsunami in December 2004. It didn't receive aid. It was a giver of aid rather than a recipient. And there's a great deal that's done within India as well. It's just that the problem is so massive that no matter how much you do, you still have this huge sea of poverty that you're dealing with. There's a lot that's being done by non-governmental organizations as well, NGOs in India. Some religiously based, some not. It's just a never-ending effort. But there is definitely work going on. The organization I'm most closely connected with, the people who invited me to teach in India, it's a Hindu organization called the Ramakrishna Mission, and they're a massive relief organization. They feed people, they have hospitals, schools, but again, the problem is just so massive that no matter how much you put into it in terms of resources, the need is always
considering there. Culture and economics, it was my impression that the caste system was shed officially some time ago, but I imagine the remnants of the caste system still operate, a bit like our former slaves in this country have had their own struggle in terms of social integration. And to what extent was the caste system a religious-based system or an economic system, and have people been able to build a better life for themselves outside of their original caste, or is there still social barriers to improving their economic status?
Okay, really good question. Okay. So caste is a massive issue, a massively complex issue. It is, I would define it as primarily an economic and a social system. It has been given religious justification at various times in history. I wouldn't call it, strictly speaking, a religious system. First of all, it transcends religion. So there are Hindu castes, but there are also Muslim castes, Christian castes, Buddhist castes, Jain castes. So the organization of people into hereditary occupational communities is something that's just very, very widely pervasive in India. It crosses religious boundaries. And in fact, it's been present in other societies as well throughout history. There were castes in Japan, for example. Now, one thing about caste is because to some extent it is ritualized, it doesn't map on perfectly to class. So it would be a mistake to assume that the poorest people in India are necessarily those that are traditionally low caste, or that the wealthiest are necessarily those who are high caste. So the Brahmins were traditionally considered the highest caste because ritually they had to be the most pure. They were people who were in charge of performing rituals and ceremonies. But there are dirt poor Brahmins in India, especially those who maintain their traditional career, because not everyone is always calling on someone to perform a wedding or a ritual, and it's a difficult life, actually. And some of the people who come from what are traditionally considered low caste backgrounds have done very well for themselves economically, partly because it's not that caste discrimination was abolished in India, but caste itself was never actually formally abolished. It was, in a sense, turned on its head. So there's a system of very aggressive affirmative action called the reservation system that has ensured that people from certain caste backgrounds get a certain percentage of government jobs. And government jobs are a lot of the jobs in India because it's this sort of more of a socialist state. So there are parts of India where people from lower caste backgrounds have actually done extremely well for themselves. There was a very strange case a few years ago where a traditionally lower caste community in Gujarat actually petitioned the government to have their caste status lowered so that they could get more of the benefits from, they were in a group that didn't get as many benefits as the group below them, and they wanted more of the benefits, so they actually had this done. When my wife was applying for university, applying for college many years ago, and her caste background is Brahmin, so that was not considered any disadvantage. She was also from a fairly wealthy neighborhood in New Delhi, and her father was an Air Force doctor. So no economic disadvantage, no disadvantage with regard to geography. She wasn't from what's called a backward area, and no disadvantage with regard to caste. If you had any of these disadvantages, you got what were called deprivation points. And these made it easier for you to get admitted into college. Well, my wife had no deprivation points. So the admissions officer said, oh, this is going to be very difficult. So she just barely got into college, purely on the strength of the fact that she had a straight A record. So she just squeaked in and was admitted to college. Now, that being said, there are still parts of India and aspects of Indian life in which caste and caste prejudice still are big problems. Even though there may be spaces, say in universities, reserved for people from low caste backgrounds, if they come from a poor area, even just because they get into college doesn't mean they're going to stay in college, because maybe they haven't developed the study skills or the abilities to really succeed because they were from a poor area. So caste does continue to be a problem. And then again, if you go to rural areas where some of these more traditional ideas are a little more hardened, you will find people excluded from certain aspects of public life based on caste. Intermarriage among castes is very strongly discouraged in those areas. And this sometimes, again, you mentioned the comparison with slavery. There'll even be things like lynchings from time to time if it's perceived that members of a certain caste have gotten too many advantages and so on. So this is still a big social problem in India, actually.